This conference wouldn't happen without the program manager at the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and that's Katie Gordon, who you've seen at registration. You've seen running around taking care of all the details that I forgot and didn't know how to handle. And next to her is Derek, who is one of our student interns, and Rania is somewhere around. We have 2 student interns that help us in the office this year, thanks to a grant that we received from the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. Here's Rania, just arrived, the other student intern. And we're ready now to have the scripture analysis. But I do want to say something before we get started. We had an interesting exchange at the end of the last session. And I'm asking our panelists as well as the audience that we will not move into political issues. It becomes just very divisive. So we want to focus on Scripture tonight, and I just wanted to warn you that'll be the rule for this evening. The other thing I'll mention is that we do this kind of format only every 3 years. But on the alternate years, there's a program that's sponsored by the Consortium of Colleges in the area. And next year, there will be a conference held at Calvin College featuring Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jew who is the professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt University and has been in our community before, and I think it'll be very exciting. You'll be getting information about that, but that'll be 1 year from next month. So anyway, any other business, or are we ready to get started? Okay, the first passage will be from Genesis, and it will be on the screen. And then if you need to move to the next passage on the screen, or do you want me to do that?
Is it touch screen?
Huh? No, it's not touch. You just have to use the down button. There you go.
Huh.
Okay.
Wow. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Just a second.
Introduce yourself. There's some new people here. You want me to?
To introduce, hi, I'm Donniel Hartman. I live in Jerusalem. Most importantly, I have 2 granddaughters. And afterwards, I'll show you all pictures. We'll put them up there. Yeah. Oh, you didn't hear? I have 2 no. Thank you. That's all the introduction that's necessary. That's all the introduction I got. I feel like the mayor, actually. And now my official time begins. As you know, this morning I was speaking about the moral challenge facing religious life, of how religions underachieve. We underachieve our goals. And I wanted to read a section of of Scripture, Genesis 18, where it's a very unique section, because Judaism is a religion which wants to keep you busy. Like, what does it mean to be a Jew? You have to do lots and lots of things. And it is very rare in our tradition that we actually put forth priorities, that we put forth some essentialist position. And that's what Genesis 18 does. And it's the first time that such a thing is done in Scripture. The context of Genesis 18 is God's decision to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, because they are cities that are profoundly wicked. We don't know about them, but the text assumes that you know, and it's speaking about these 2 horrific cities. And God turns to Abraham and consults with Abraham. Now, in the context of God turning to Abraham and Abraham responding to God, some central principles about what does it mean to create a religious life which focuses on the ethical are revealed. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him? And now, for I have singled him out." In many ways, I've picked him. God is saying the essence of the covenant between God and the Jewish people, the foundation for the election, which in Genesis 12 had no explanation, and which, according to a long course feature of our tradition, is simply an election which has neither any explanation and it's simply passed down to family members. Here in Genesis 18, God says, do you know why I picked Abraham? For one reason. Because he, and it's not that he may, this is a mistake, because he will. Because he is somebody who is going to instruct his children to walk in the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. And here, God is basically declaring to Abraham, you may be able to do the Jewish story and not keep Shabbat. You're able to do the Jewish story and not keep the dietary laws. You could keep Shabbat, you could keep Judaism and not observe the calendar. You might even be able to keep Judaism in some paradoxical way and not even believe in God. But the minute justice and righteousness are not core features of what you define as walking in the way of God, you're outside of the Jewish story. This is what I called this morning the primacy of the good. God is declaring, this is the essence of you want to do Jewish? You want to do Jewish? Then a conversation with justice and righteousness has to be an essential part of what you do. Otherwise, you're doing another religion. You're doing another religion. You worry about Jewish survival? Great. You worry about Judaism? Great. Know that Judaism and Jewish survival are important only to the extent that justice and righteousness are core aspirations of yours. The primacy of the good within the Jewish tradition. But then what's actually remarkable is what is the first expression of the primacy of the good in Judaism? What's the first expression of an individual says, I'm walking in the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right? So what's the test? The test is the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now if you were Abraham, and God said to you, I'm about to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, I have a whole list of responses. The first one could be, forget theological, we'll get to the great theological ones later. What are you speaking to me for? Like, what is Sodom and Gomorrah to me? What do I care about Sodom and Gomorrah? If you were on to talk to me, I want to do this to Isaac or Ishmael, what? We're not part of the same clan, we're not part of the same tribe, we're not part of the same nation state, nothing. Each city was functioned as its own minor city-state. There's nothing to me. Justice and righteousness are tested not by the way you treat your family, your kin. The first expression of justice and righteousness in the Bible is that it demands of you to respond to something that's going to happen to somebody with whom you have no kinship. You have no religious affiliation. And if you only care about justice and righteousness to your family and to your fellow co-religionists, then it's not justice and righteousness. That's what the Bible's teaching. It's not justice and righteousness for Jews. It's not justice and righteousness for Americans. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. It's somebody else. And if that's a core value, that's where it gets tested. The first principle of justice and righteousness, of the ethical, is the primacy of the good. The second is the domain of the good. The domain has to be universal. It has to be an expression of the way our biblical tradition started. Because the biblical tradition doesn't start with the story of the Jews. The story of the Jews is first chapter 12. The Bible starts with humanity. It starts with the creation of human beings. And it creates the fundamental principle that it is not Jews who are created in the image of God, but it's human beings created in the image of God. And if human beings are created in the image of God, that has to be the domain of your ethical aspirations. Otherwise, there's something flawed. Otherwise, it's not justice and righteousness which is motivating you. It's some notion of family relationships and responsibilities. And that's why I picked you. That's the essence of the particular covenant. And so it is a particular covenant which translates and obligates you to transcend your covenantal partners and to live in the midst of a world for which you are responsible. And Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? And in Genesis 18, it's not merely that you are your brother's keeper. You are the keeper of all human beings created in the image of God. And this is the first model of that. The third principle is what I called this morning the independence of the good. Abraham turns to God and says, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty are alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Abraham turns to God and engages in a conversation that nobody, Cynthia, we were speaking about this morning, which is completely antithetical to our perception of what a pious individual does. A pious individual has to say amen. Amen. A pious individual experiences God's transcendence and allows God's transcendence to be the defining feature. My job as a religious person is to listen and to await your guidance. On the basis of what does Abraham say, shall the judge of the whole earth not deal justly? Where does he get it from? You can't even argue that he gets it from Scripture because there is none yet. Torah didn't happen yet. It's not there. A human being stands before God and says, God, both you and I, that same justice and righteousness that you obligated me to, obligates you. Shall the judge of the whole earth not deal justly? I'm commanded to do justice. You said that I'm supposed to walk in the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. The way of the Lord is just and right. But the Lord doesn't define by definition what is just and right. The Lord has to comply to principles of justice and righteousness to the same extent that human beings do. And the Lord can be tried and found guilty. This, according to the Bible, is not a path of heresy. This is actually a life of faith. And if we have created some notion of religiosity in which this is somehow less religious, Genesis 18 says, I think it's time for you to redefine what it means to be religious. The fourth principle is the principle and the duplication of words, justice and righteousness. And here I want to key you into a rabbinic, a Jewish way of reading texts. Anytime there's a word that's unnecessary, seemingly, there's a meaning for it. If it says justice and righteousness, could have just said justice or righteousness. If there's two, it's coming to teach us something. And the rabbinic tradition teaches us that the enemy of justice is pure justice. Actually, going back, Ingrid, to the issue that you spoke about when it came to compromise. And there's a tradition which says, let the truth, or let Yikov Adina Tahar, let the mountain, let the law pierce the mountain. Whatever the law says must be. And the rabbis say no. We look for justice with righteousness. And justice with righteousness means compromise. Means not following the law, not following the prescription, but being willing to pursue justice by understanding that sometimes you have to have a less perfect justice. Sometimes in the name of our ethical principles, precisely in the name of our ethical principles, we perpetrate the greatest evil on other human beings. We have some notion of perfect justice, which we want to implant on the human condition. And it gives us, going back to Cynthia's comments beforehand, with that justice that we have now determined, we have the arrogance to trample all. Genesis 18 says, I want justice and righteousness. And the last principle, and with that I'll conclude, is you think that after Abraham spoke to God, and God says, okay, I won't destroy the city for the sake of 50, Abraham would count himself lucky and go home. You got remember, this is a God who brings floods. You don't start up with God so quickly. It's like, so Abraham says, here I venture to speak to my Lord, who am I but dust and ashes? But what about 45? Okay, I got you 45. Oh, maybe there's 40. You got 40. Oh, don't be angry at me, but what if there's 30? Who am I to venture to speak? What about 20? Don't be angry at me. I'm going to speak one last time on but does it 10? I won't get into why Abraham stops at 10, because I don't know the answer. So we'll just sort of forget that issue for today. But here is the fifth principle of justice. Fifth principle of a religious tradition motivated by a commitment to do the good. And that is that a commitment to do the good doesn't stop. If justice and righteousness define your religious tradition, it's not like a holiday. I kept Shabbos. I did it. I tried. When justice and righteousness truly define you, it has to be a way of life. Didn't succeed? Get up and try again. Didn't work? Get up and try again. The other person wasn't responsive? Get up and try again. It's a way of life. The primacy of the good, the parameters of the good being humanity and not just your family. The fact that the good and justice is something that obligates God and you alike, and therefore God could never control it. But your job as a human being is to stand up when you think your religious tradition fails and to say, excuse me, this is not worthy of you, because God has to be obligated by justice and righteousness just as I do, and God doesn't define it. That sometimes the enemy of justice is justice. Perfect justice is often a foundation for great evil in the world. And finally, the notion that justice and righteousness has to be a constant feature that reemerges in your life over and again. When this becomes, when we embody the independence, we embody the primacy of the good, and we recognize it as a journey that never ceases, then religion will be a vehicle and a tool for healing instead of harm. Thank you.
Next, Reverend Dr. Cynthia Campbell, the former president of McCormick Theological Seminary and now a pastor in Louisville, will explicate the text from Matthew.
When we were asked to prepare for this session, we were invited to name a text out of our tradition that leads towards the healing or the repair, or that is a source for the good. We talked a lot this morning about the things in our religious tradition that lead to harm. Now, what about the other side of the ledger? And there are a lot of places that I could have gone. Jesus often talks about summarizing the law as the love of God and neighbor, the twofold command, of course, a summary of Torah. There are lots of statements in John in particular about loving one another, Paul on reconciliation. I decided to go with this very familiar parable, partly because it's a narrative, but because it's been such a compelling parable for so long. The picture here that Jesus paints is of the final judgment. This text is the very last of Jesus' teaching moments in his life in the Gospel of Matthew. The next thing that happens after this is the beginning of the path that leads to death, to his death. So this is, in Matthew's mind, as the architect of this gospel, the last teaching moment. So one ought to pay attention to that. The picture that Jesus paints in this parable of the Last Judgment is the king who is a shepherd. This, again, is another deeply Old Testament image. It's David, among other things. The shepherd king. What is the good shepherd king? Well, the good king is the good shepherd who cares for and supports and protects the flock. So this is the scene of this parable, in which the shepherd king then says to those whom the shepherd king says are the redeemed, "Come, O blessed of my Father, for I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And that group then says, when did that happen? When did we see you in any of those places? And the king's answer is, when you did it to one of the least of these members of my family, is probably a better translation, you did it to me. And then the story goes on in good story form. The others, thank you, say, the king says, "I was hungry and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing. I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. Needed clothes and you did nothing. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me." The same question, when did we see you in that way? And the king replies, "Whenever you did not do to the least of these, you did not do it to me." So this enshrines, this story enshrines sort of the core of practice that is held up as Jesus' teaching of right practice. Notice that the story of judgment involves all people. And the turning point of judgment in this parable is not what do they believe. It is not religious affiliation. It is about behavior. In particular, it is about who responds to the people in greatest need. And the twist in this parable is that neither those who acted appropriately nor those who failed to act, neither one of them recognized the Messiah in the ones in need. So everybody saw the same thing, people in need. Some responded and some didn't. None of them saw that those persons in need were the Messiah. So the focal point of this parable, according to one of my friends, Tom Long, is the way in which Jesus identifies himself with the most vulnerable. The world will be judged according to whether it did or did not show hospitality to the Messiah, who is clothed not in majesty, but coming to the world hidden among the least of these. Now, the actions that are described in this, in fact, are not uniquely Christian at all. They are, in fact, the core practices that Judaism would have always lifted up as core practices for acts of mercy, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, etc. The one addition that doesn't come from Jewish tradition, interestingly, is visiting the one in prison. Some commentators say that this is added because it reflects a later period in the text of Christians themselves being imprisoned. And thus visiting or caring for the imprisoned one is how that made it on the list. But in any case, it is a list with deep resonance. It's not new. This is not a new teaching, but it's a consolidation and an uplifting of these core values. All of these, everything on this list, plus something else, the burying of the dead, becomes the list of the corporal works of mercy in Catholic teaching. So this list becomes enshrined as part of what Christian practice should be. Now, one of the things that Christians say we believe, and some of us believe it in different ways, is that we look for the second coming of Christ. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, says one of the creeds. This parable suggests to us, I think, that Christ is already here. We do not need to simply be expecting another messianic appearance. The Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, is already here in the persons who are in deepest need, who are most vulnerable. And herein lies our judgment on how we respond to people in deepest need. John Buchanan, one of my friends, summarizes it this way: God is not remote, but here in the face of the most needy. And God wants to save our lives by persuading us to see and care for those who need us most. I see this text as one way of bringing us back as a test of all the rest of our actions or our policies or things that we might espouse. What does it do for those who are most vulnerable? That, I think, if we kept that image before us, religion might, or Christianity, I'll speak for myself, Christianity might step back from some of our proposed activities and not take those steps if we used this as a guide for how we live our lives as religious people.
Next, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, the Professor Chair of Islamic Studies at the University of Western Ontario and former President for 4 years of the Islamic Society of North America, will explicate a text from the Holy Quran.
My dean's going to be mad at me if I don't clarify that I am at Huron College, which is one of the colleges at Western University. So, he told me that last time. So I am very grateful to be at the Anglican College, historically Anglican College, founding college of the University of Western Ontario in London. Like Cynthia, I could have chosen many passages, and I think my first inclination was to look at the passages of the Quran that deal with the neighbor, because the Quran talks about the neighbor who's near, or the neighbor who is related to you, and the neighbor who's far, and it's a very rich source of understanding and giving us an embodied sense of responsibility, which I think is very important today. By an embodied sense, it means that we pay attention to where we actually live, rather than have this imagined community that we believe we belong to and that we're very worried about and concerned about. We pay attention to the people who share our walls and our land and our water and all of the things, our air. All of that's very important, but I think in order to really understand that and do that, this passage helps ground us. And I think being grounded is really important. Having realism in religion, meaning that God did create us in this world, and there's no way to get to Him until we finish our work in this world. This is one of my favorite surahs. Surah means it's translated often as chapter. It's the section of the Quran called Rum, the Romans, And you might think, oh, Romans, because I think when you hear about Romans in the Bible, usually they're bad guys. But interestingly, the Romans here are the good guys. God's celebrating, which is something we could talk about someday, celebrating the future victory of the Christian Roman Empire against the Zoroastrian Sasanians in the Quran. And it always made me wonder what the Muslims who then later were fighting the Eastern Roman Empire thought about as they recited the early verses of this chapter. But this section here, what I really like about it is it's about, in my mind, about our need to pay attention to where we are, to pay attention to our relationship to the rest of creation, and to understand that while God is one, all of creation is diverse. Diversity is the law of creation. And among his signs is this: he created you out of dust, and behold, you became human beings, ranging far and wide. So there we are. We have a common origin as human beings from this earth. We are earthlings. But then we scatter out, and ranging far and wide means that we have geographical, ecological circumstances that shape our norms, our customs, our lifestyles that will make us different. And among his signs, and by the way, this word sign, ayah or ayat, is the same word that we use for verses of the Quran. So a verse of the Quran is called an ayah, and all of these things that are being pointed out in God's creation are called ayat. So it's the same thing, which is the reason why scholars say that there are really two books of God in a way, or two kinds of books. There are the books that are God's speech that are revealed in words, and then there is the book of creation that is filled with all these ayat. And this is really about bringing our attention to God's book, which is creation. And among his signs is this: he creates for you mates out of your own selves, so that you might find comfort with them. And he engenders love and mercy between you. In this, indeed, are signs for people who think. Clearly, here's the reason for God creating us with a partner, to find a partner in order to seek love and mercy. It gives the purpose for that. And how many problems are caused because we forget the true purpose of why we should be in the companionship of another person. But here begins a series of verses that end with a certain way of thinking or contemplating or engaging with our intellectual capacity in the world. So here we have the creation of our mates. These are signs for those who think. And among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your language and colors. In this are signs for the knowledgeable. So we have thinking, we have knowledge. And the knowledge comes from those who reflect on the fact that there is heaven and earth, and that there are different languages, and that there are different colors among people. And among his signs is your sleep at night or in the daytime, cross out by night and day, that's a typo. And among his signs is your sleep at night or in the daytime, and your seeking of his bounty. In this are signs for people who listen. Listen. I really like this verse because I'm a night owl. So I actually like to sleep during the day. I like to stay up. So when people are always telling me, well, early to bed, early to rise, the early bird gets the worm, all this, I say, you need some people who are vigilant at night and then take the rest in the day. And so even this, here the Quran accommodates the diversity of our, circadian rhythms or something. And among his signs is this: he shows you lightning. That should say lightning, not lighting. He's not showing us chandeliers. God is showing us lightning, which causes fear and hope. And he sends down water from the sky to enliven the earth after it has been lifeless. Indeed, in this are signs for those who use their intellect. And here is the human condition, always between fear and hope. We see something could be good for us, it could be bad. Storm clouds come and they could bring us life-giving rain, or they could flood out our homes and cause vast destruction. We just simply don't know. But again, all of these are things for us to reflect upon if we use our intellect. So this emphasis on thinking, knowledge, listening, engaging with our intellect between ourselves, creating a relationship between ourselves and the world, understanding that we're part of this diversity, but it's all within God's universe, shows to me the points that we need to pay attention to, and if we don't, then this is a source of destruction. As I mentioned in my talk, I believe that integrating and really understanding the role of God-given reason and intellect and reflection, and it's not just rationality in the Enlightenment sense, but it's all the ways that God gave us to think. Intuition, common sense, imagination. Imagination is so important for repairing the world. In another passage of the Quran says, it may be that God will place love between you and those whom you now consider enemies. Now that takes a great feat of imagination, which is a mental state. But it's not about logic. It's not about scientific inquiry. It is the imaginative faculty. Can I imagine? And there are people we consider enemies. This is a word that the Quran used. Your enemies. These are the people who are trying to kill you or who have killed you or have attacked you. Imagine, put yourself in the position of imagining that at some point, not that just you have peace, but there's actually love between you. You love these people. That is a way of thinking that allows us to have hope and move towards something. But then going down, and this is one of the main reasons why I chose this passage. This passage at the end talks about religion. And our mission today was to talk about whether religion can be a source for repairing the world. And so one of the things I did is I said, well, let me search the Quran and see when the Quran actually speaks about religion per se, deen, religion as a category. And it was interesting to me because the majority of times that the Quran speaks about religion, it does so in the context of a passage criticizing the splitting up or sectarianism or arguing over religion. Again and again in the Quran, religion is mentioned with a warning not to fall in dispute over it. So it says here, and I'll translate some of these terms after. So turn your face steadfastly toward the primordial religion, the innate morality which God has placed within people. There is no substitution for God's creation. That is the right religion, which most people do not use their intellect. You should be turning unto him, be mindful of him, establish prayer, and do not be among those who ascribe partners to him, for those who have divided their religion become sectarian, with each sect exalting in their own way. It is the biggest temptation for religious people, for those who identify themselves as religion, for religions to be very focused on who's right about certain ideas. And splitting up and having that splitting and divisiveness and argumentation becoming a source of great disagreement. But what is it that's being stated here as the right religion? The word, what's described as, I've translated here as primordial religion, al-din al-hanif, Abraham was called a Hanif, is called a Hanif in the Quran, and it really means just one who goes on the right way. And then the innate morality, and we talked about morality in religion. Innate morality here, and what's understood from other places in the Quran where this is spoken about, is that human beings are born with an innate capacity for morality. An innate capacity for morality. So having that, holding on to that within the capacity of God's creation, there's no substitute for God's creation, and we just went through many aspects of God's creation, all of this diversity in nature and among human beings, and in human beings in their bodies and in their culture. Understanding this is the right religion if we use our intellect. So there are necessary elements that have to be woven together and integrated together in order to not just become that religious narcissism of turning in and arguing over these dogmatic differences, and each group of us exalting, not even just being happy, but exalting in our particular understanding of it. Okay?
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Do you want to interact first? Any comments on anybody else from the panel? Okay, we have a few minutes to take some questions. Please come to your mic here or over here if you have a question for our panel. Yeah, and it may need to be turned on. There's someone.
Thank you. Question for Carolyn on the Matthew text. And I really appreciate, beside your scholarliness that you also bring your pastoral quality to what you do, and I hear that and I appreciate that. I have walked down streets when I was in Detroit working that there were so many people there in need, I could not possibly respond to this. Right. And then that last sentence about eternal punishment. Where I have gone with that is to recognize and been highly involved with Lutheran Social Services of Michigan because I can do more that way. But I would appreciate it if you would comment on that, and particularly how the punishment issue comes in when we're really trying to talk about something much, much, much more.
I had intended actually to talk about that because it's the context of this, the scene itself, and the notion of the judgment here is it makes this a troubling text as well as a text of power, and a very positive text, but a text that has within it some of the very violence that I was talking about this morning, which is why I think it's hard to turn Jesus into an absolute pacifist, because there are too many stories, too many times when this image of apocalyptic judgment are interlaced in his parables. They're just part of that is the religious world. These similar ideas to this were there in the religious world in which he lived. It's part of the background. So I think one has to kind of say, I want to sort of prescind from this and say, I don't think I believe in eternal damnation. That's a part of the context of this. But I do think that we are changed, we are shaped by what we do and what we fail to do. And that is the judgment. The judgment isn't an at the end. It is a judgment that goes through our lives as we either do or don't, as we either do respond to those in need or we don't respond to those in need. obviously, that really is the question. My husband and I actually talk about this a lot. My husband is much more of the seeing people who are in need on the street and partly because he's a guy and because he carries unbelievable amounts of loose change in his pockets, which makes me crazy, but that's another topic. He's got ready cash there. He feels that. He knows there are all kinds of problems with that. He knows that may or may not be the best thing to do, but for him, it's an action he feels called upon to do something. Now, we also do all other kinds of things in terms of organizations, Lutheran Social Services, our church is involved in a laundry list of both direct service activities, but also political efforts around what is the shape of poverty and why does it exist and how do we understand what conditions might be what things might be done to ameliorate those. So I take this text as a place to say it's not just about direct charity. It is about direct charity, but in our modern world, it's about much more than that for those of us who are capable of working in society in ways that begin to ameliorate or reduce or eliminate the underlying conditions that lead to people being in this vulnerable state in the first place. So it's a political text, Doug. I'm really sorry, but it's there's politics laced through all of this.
All right. Go ahead. Turn it on.
Hello. This is addressed to Ingrid, the Islamic lady. I'm Jewish, and I'm usually used to reading the Torah, a little bit of the Bible. I'm just ashamed to say, really had a close reading of anything from the Quran. And what really strikes me is it's so modern. I mean, I'm sure people don't say that to you ever, but it seems, compared to reading the Torah, it just seems so modern. You know, they're, don't be sectarian, go back to the primordial religion. It's almost like you're going back to the old ways. And I just can't imagine these texts in the Torah, which was thousands of years before, and I would like you to comment on that if you want to.
Well, there is a significant time difference. So when we look at the 7th century, the Quran is looking at kind of ongoing problems that human beings will always face, as well as a certain point in history. And so the Quran's coming at a time where Christianity has developed a number of sects. Judaism has a few different schools, and the Quran's aware of that. And what's interesting is that so often the Quran is saying, and this is, what's even more interesting is how do we translate the word Islam? Because many Muslims will say, well, when the Quran talks about Islam, that's our religion, Islam. But when the Quran uses the term Islam, it's hard if you're not objective. If you're objective, it's very hard not to see that it is using it as an active verb. It's submission to God. But then how does submission to God become another world religion? When the Quran is saying, don't become another, don't have these things. So did Islam as it developed fall into the same mistake that it was criticizing, in fact? So it's quite interesting to see that. But I think it's also, I think one of the things that I find about the Quran is that I think because of the age and what was going on in the world at that time, it does speak in maybe terms that are a little bit more, we're more capable of of relating to in some ways, in particular to the urban environment. For example, we know that humanity has increasingly moved to be more urban than agricultural, although there's still farms, obviously, and that we're going to be, within the next few decades, most of humanity will be in urban centers. And the Quran's speaking to those kind of people who had recently, the Arabs of the time had recently, many of them had moved from being nomadic to settled. So even the Prophet Muhammad's own tribe were recently settled full-time as sedentary people. And urban life itself brought new ethical priorities. So there's a lot of focus on trust and trade and buying and selling in the marketplace and the behavior of the marketplace and dealing in a urban environment where there are different kinds of tribes and sects and languages. So I think to that extent that there are themes there that we can resonate with, because the Quran's coming in at a time in human progress when we've just continued more in that trajectory that humanity was on already in the 7th century.
Any final comments from the Mohammed?
Quick question for
I think it's on.
Rabbi Hartman. You mentioned in previous comments about in your faith, you said Moses is the last prophet. So just my question is, to be a true Muslim, I have to believe in Moses and Jesus. So what's your faith speak about other religion? And just also minor comment or correction about the prosecuted minority. You mentioned about prosecuted minority. I just want a reminder for the rest of the people that Christian and Jews lived in the last 1400 years under Islamic rule without any prosecution. So I just want to make sure it's clear to everybody else.
You got it in. No problem. Last word.
Turn it
on. Moses is the last prophetic lawgiver, and your question is really important because it allows me to clarify. He's the last prophetic lawgiver for Jews. In other words, nobody else could speak within the context of Judaism as a prophet. But that said, classical Judaism has great difficulty assuming that there is a covenant, that there is something that replaces it. Judaism, one of the great flaws of Judaism is that it introduced the notion of one God, but it didn't think about whether the nations of the world will have prophecy and their own private relationship with that God outside of Judaism. It didn't think in those terms. And part of the development of Judaism post the Bible is the creation of the possibility of even thinking in that context. But when Judaism really starts thinking about it is first in the 19th and 20th centuries. Prior to that, Judaism never believed that love of God or redemption was exclusively to Jews. Didn't believe that. You didn't have to be Jewish to be loved by God, and you didn't need to observe Judaism in order to be redeemed. But the concept of another authentic religious tradition, that the God who chose us could choose as well others, is something that before the 19th century, more or less, didn't exist. And the test of Judaism, when Judaism had to think about Islam and Christianity, the question was whether Islam and Christianity fell under the category of idolatry or not. And Islam was immediately recognized as non-idolatrous. Christianity ultimately became to be understood similarly. And therefore, Judaism could assimilate the values inherent within them without a notion that there is a revealed word. That there's a revealed word which is separate then. And that's one of the challenges of the person who comes first. You know, the person who came first thinks that you're the first and it's sufficient. It's sufficient. It's only now, in a deep way, and again, I don't want to speak for Islam, but while Moses and David and Aaron could be prophets, did these prophets speak Judaism? Or did they speak Islam? And did the Jewish people, is our version of their prophecy a corruption of the original prophecy? So there's also, all of us have difficulty recognizing that there is a completely other, distinct, revealed word. Christianity could accept that there is one, but it's the Old Testament. What do you mean? That's why I speak about the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. Like, I can't speak about, I'm not the old, unless the old is, oh, you're the old, original, sweet and kind, but that's not exactly what it meant. It was old, new, and supersessionist. And so all of us, in different terms, even though we might accept different, the notion that God could actually have a different revelation to different people in distinct ways. There's a little verse, I think, in Amos which might hint to it, maybe. Or maybe, like, it's like something, but it's not really. That is a truly contemporary understanding, which grows out of our taking the idea of an infinite God more seriously. If God is truly infinite, then no single revelation could exhaust the word and will of God. So it's that move. In other words, it's not enough to say Moses is a prophet. The question is, can you say that Judaism qua Judaism, Islam qua Islam, as Muslims understand it, Christianity qua Christianity, all reflect a particular moment of chosenness, that God reaches out and has another relationship with someone whom God loves as much as you. Now, in every time we Jews make a blessing over the wine on Friday night, or very often within our services, we have a verse, we thank God for choosing us. Kivanu v'charta, because you have chosen us. But the next verse is, Kivanu v'charta mikol ha'amim. You have chosen us over and above all other nations of the world. I've stopped, I say the first part, and if you wanted me to sing, I'll sing. You were waiting for this moment, you're all in? Because in the sanctification over the wine in the nighttime, it goes, Kivanu v'charta, v'otanu kidashta, mikol ha'amim, because you have chosen us and sanctified us for over and above all the nations of the world. When I recite the Kiddush, I say, Kivanu v'charta, v'otanu kidashta, la la lai 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 lai. I don't believe that God has chosen me over and above others. I believe that God has chosen me. And I believe that each religious tradition should feel that they've been chosen. And more than that, each one of us should feel that an infinite God is capable of choosing and loving equally, not just different people, but also different religious traditions as equally authentic.
Question here? Yes.
I'd be curious to ask Cynthia how she fares with that when the Jew that we believe in said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's a loaded question, I know, Cynthia. You'll deal with it well, I'm sure.
Well, it's a great text. It's a familiar text, and it's just not about religious diversity. The context of that text is that Jesus is on his way to death. He's on his way to glory. This is a Johannine text. He's on his way to the fulfillment of his mission. And he is saying, you want to get to God, you've got to follow the way. I am the way, and the way is going to the cross. I think it's exactly an identical passage in John's Gospel to the synoptic. If anyone would be my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. It's the same idea. It just doesn't have anything to do with religious diversity. And it's been lifted out of its context in the upper room, in the preparing for the final moment of suffering. It's been lifted out of that context and made to do something it was never intended to do, as far as I can tell from reading that text.
And Mount Mercy?
It will be the final call. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate for what you did today. It's outstanding job. Thank you so much for what you did. God bless you all, and this for everybody attended this discussion. It's very amazing job for everybody. Just I have something quickly to add to my sister. Just as a purification for some verses just that she chose. MashaAllah, it's very good verses. We have a lot of verses in the Quran just explain all these situations. But I would like to add one verse in the same chapter, in the chapter of Romans. It's number 41. After God explained all these signs for mankind, and he explained in the end, and he says, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر. Mischief is appeared in the seas and in the land. For what? Because of what? بما كسبت أيدي الناس. Because the people's hands earned. ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا. And he will give them a chance to go through the big task from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as trials for them to realize that they did wrong. When we look at all universals, we never find any mistakes. In other creation, we will see the sun working very well on time. The moon, the stars, everything working perfectly, except the land. Why? Because the land, we have control of land. And when we have control, when we have power, we will use our power to have mischief, to destroy the creation that Allah created to serve us. When we look at the sun, at the moon, all universal, they are working very perfectly. But for the land or for the sea, we will dump the trash and some bad stuff into the sea, and we will receive the consequences of our actions, and we blame others. We have to blame ourselves, not others. We blame Allah. We should not blame Allah, because Allah did not make wrong for any one of his servants, but the servants, they did wrong for themselves. Just I would like to add this one to clarify the point. And if we do wrong, we should not blame anyone except ourselves. And we here only for just temporary life. We have to know our real life, it will be there in hereafter, not here. We are travelers. We need to know we must leave the bus one day. And it's coming very soon. Even if we think that we're still very young, but it's very soon. Like Prophet Jesus says, who has the night and the day as a transportation, he will reach his distance even if he did not walk. And we are, all of us, we have the night and the days as transportation for our hereafter. Just the other comment very quickly for Dr. Donniel. When Allah explained in the Quran, I am the person who memorized Quran by heart since I was 9 years old in my village back home in Egypt. Anyway, and when Allah mentioned that he chose the nation of Bani Israel, which is true. This is the very clear verse in the Quran. We believe that. But when Allah destroyed Pharaoh and his soldiers in Red Sea, and this is a very famous story, and in that moment, no one on the earth was worshipping Allah except the nation of Bani Israel. And this is the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala testify for them, you are the best nation among all nations, because no one in that time was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except them. And this is the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described them that you are, I have chosen you among all the nations of Al-Alameen in that time, not after that. That's just to clarify this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Imam Morsi. Does any of the panel want to respond? Okay, to conclude, I want to point out something that happened 23 years ago. I wasn't there, but at the first Jewish-Christian dialogue that was held in Muskegon under the sponsorship of Sylvia Kaufman, the story that I've been told is that at one point, David Hartman, the founder of the Hartman Institute and the father of Donniel Hartman, said to Krister Stendahl, the dean of Harvard Divinity School and later the bishop of the Church of Sweden, after a long day's worth of dialogue, he finally said, "Krister, do I have to be wrong for you to be right?" And Krister said, "I'm too tired." And David Hartman said, "No, you're not. You have to answer that question." And Krister said, "No, you don't have to be wrong for me to be right." And I believe for our communities anyway, that was a turning point away from exclusivism, away from the idea that there's only one way, and that happens to be my way, only one way to be blessed by God or to serve. I would like to think this is another turning point in today's activities, another reaffirmation that we all can flourish, our religions can all be right. We don't have to find wrong, but we can be right and we can support and appreciate each other. Before we close, I do want to thank Imam Morsi and the members of the Al-Tawhid Mosque who were the sponsors of Ingrid Mattson, and the representatives from the Chaim and Greta Berkowitz Foundation who were the sponsors of Donniel Hartman. And thank you for sponsoring our speakers, and a special thank you to our speakers. You've done a wonderful job. It's been a long day, but you've held up. Thank you very much.